Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. I conduct sales calls all the time from marketers who know they want to start a podcast. They understand the combination of audio content and video content and long-form 20, 30, 40, 60-minute conversations will allow them to create video content as a business, will allow them to be in multiple channels, whether that's YouTube or Apple Podcast or Spotify, or have content for LinkedIn or Twitter or Instagram. They understand that it'll provide written content. You'll get a transcript and you can leverage that into a variety of written content, whether that is a show notes page on your website or writing blog posts. They get it. We have a great conversation. They tell me, Justin, I really want to work together. I want to do this podcast. And then from there, they have to go and convince leadership, whether that is a CEO or a CMO or a board or a mixture of all of the above, that this podcast is a good idea. And so they have to head into that conversation. And when they do, they get peppered with questions. And the issue is that a lot of the people that I talk to, I'd say even the vast majority, I've never created a podcast before. And while they understand the value of that podcast, they aren't able to answer all of the questions that they're being asked. Podcasting is hard. It's the first slide in my sales deck, actually, when I'm talking to a potential customer or a marketer that is asking about doing a podcast. I say, podcasting is hard, and it's even harder to create a great show. It's my first slide. And the reason I have that is because there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of aspects to podcasting. Where will your podcast be hosted? What is going to be your frequency? What's the name of the show? What's the theme of the show? Those are just a handful of questions that could be asked in that meeting with leadership. So my biggest recommendation when heading into that conversation and trying to convince them that a podcast is the right avenue for your business is to go in prepared and with a plan. And look, if you're using an agency, sure, they may be the ones who are going to help you with that strategy. I know that when someone works with us, we create a 25-page document outlining everything from the theme to the guest profile to audience to show structure, etc. We'll help our customers to create the design from cover art to video storyboards to standalone quote cards. But it's not usually enough for a marketer to go to their boss and say, don't worry about it. It's going to be handled by our agency, or it's going to be handled by Motion, or it's going to be handled by this podcast person that I talk to. You're going to have to define those things most likely in advance if you're going to want leadership to approve your podcast. It leads me to think about one of our customers, Colby, or Colby Corp. Their VP of marketing, Toby Phillips, he's actually been on this show before. And when he was setting out to get approval on his podcast, he was able to really map out the show in advance. Despite the fact that they were planning on using an agency, or at least he wanted to. He set out doing some small video segments with the CEO. He was actually recording them in Riverside and then using them to put out on social media. So he got some form of use case in advance that he could snowball into his podcast. He then was able to come up with a show name, a structure of a show. He understood how podcasting worked, from hosting to distribution, and really the process of it all. He understood the value of having the CEO and president of the company to do more than just talk to camera themselves, but bringing on guests, and the value that adding this podcast into additional channels, more than just the series that they were putting on social media, so that when he went to get approval for the show, he not only already had a use case on a smaller scale of how it could work, but he was able to identify on a larger scale what it actually looks like. So when setting out to create your show plan, there are a handful of key components you'll want to build out in that podcast business plan in advance, and I'm going to outline those here. So the first thing you'll want to build out is your objectives. Before you start creating and recording episodes for your podcast, it's essential to clearly define the goals and objectives of the show in your podcast plan. Understand your objectives for how you're going to create content that's focused, relevant, and engaging for your target audience. It'll also help you get started on solid ground with that management team. Once you've identified those goals and objectives of your podcast, the next step is to define your target audience. And from my perspective, a successful B2B podcast defines two things really well up front. It captures who the show is for and how it helps. The next piece is developing your content strategy. The target audience is who the show is for, and your content strategy is how the show is going to help them. You're also going to want to outline your distribution plan. When you produce a podcast business plan, it's important to discuss how the podcast will get distributed to your ideal audience. But there's one more important thing you need to know. A podcast is more than just an audio channel. Your company's podcast is so much more than an MP3 file distributed on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Especially if you produce a video podcast, the show can be a centerpiece for your company's entire content marketing strategy. You'll want to identify your budget and resources. In order to produce a high-quality podcast, you'll need to allocate the appropriate budget and resources to this initiative. This includes both financial and non-financial resources such as time, equipment, and talent. And the final thing here is you're going to want to know how you're going to measure success. When it comes to evaluating the return on investment or ROI of a podcast, it's important to consider both the key performance indicators, KPIs, and the efficiency and quality of the content you create. On the one hand, you can measure the impact of your podcast with a basic list of KPIs such as subscribers, followers, downloads, website traffic, social engagement, reviews, mentions, and/or revenue. These metrics can give you a sense of the reach and impact of your podcast on your target audience. While I know that's probably a lot to take in from just this podcast episode, we do have two resources that can really help you. On our blog, we have a nearly 3,000-word blog post on our podcast business plan and the key to convincing your CEO to invest in a podcast. So please check that out. And we also have an editable PDF of our strategic action plan workbook. The workbook has fields for you to brainstorm everything from the name of your show to your ideal listener to the show format, hosts, topics, design, deliverables, software tools, equipment, outreach, frequency, distribution, KPIs, and more. Those are only a handful of the fields that are in there. It's editable PDF, so you can actually have that and use that as the tool to go into that meeting with your CEO, CMO, board to try and convince them that this is a good idea. Both of those resources, both the blog post and the workbook, will be linked in the show notes, and I hope you get a chance to use these free materials. That's all for this episode of Recorded Content. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Recorded Content, a show brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcasting agency for B2B tech marketers. We do the podcast stuff so you can focus on strategy, building brand awareness, and developing new relationships. To learn more about how you can launch and grow a podcast for your company, check out motionagency.io. Thanks for listening to Recorded Content.